All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on time today. I am a stickler for time, so I'm going to kick us off, and we have a couple of little intro slides to get to before I hand it over to our facilitator for today. But as I'm doing that, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We always love to know who all's here today and what organization you represent. So I'm seeing great representation from all the counties. So glad to see everybody from the beaches and from, Barnabas and Jax. So hey, everybody. Today, we're here talking about financial oversight for board members. This is a session that directly comes from feedback from you all. We did a big program survey in the fall of 21, and we asked you all, what did you need more of? What did you want to hear from us about? And, financial oversight was a big one. So I'm really excited that we're able to offer this session, and I hope it provides some great tools and resources for you all. So my name is Callum Brown. I'm a program director at the Nonprofit Center. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll be helping to moderate today, like the chat and things. So as we go along, when David's speaking, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If you have, maybe like an anonymous question, you don't want your name tagged to it for any reason, you can actually hover over that everyone in the chat box and have it go directly to me, Callan, and I can direct that question for you. Of course, everybody's on mute right now. There probably will be points later on where, we'll just have group discussion. And so feel free to unmute at that time and just get comfortable with where that is. I feel like everybody's pretty comfortable with Zoom, but if you are having any issues at all during the presentation, feel free to chat me here, or also I'll put my email in the chat. You can send me a quick note if you're having any trouble. So we are here with the Nonprofit Center. We exist to connect, strengthen, and advocate for a strong nonprofit community. We do that in so many ways. Of course, we have hundreds of trainings we provide each year, and we definitely are trying to beef up our board offerings. So we have a whole series, the Ahead of the Curve board series, and we just love to hear from you all. We will have a survey at the end of the session today to let us know how you felt the session went. And there's a question on there, what other board trainings or topics are you interested in hearing from us about? Please fill out that survey and let us know. We just love to capture your feedback, and we really do make adjustments based on what you say you need. But additionally, we have, our jobs bank. We do a ton of research for the sector. And just if you don't remember or haven't seen it in a while, we do have a board bank. So if you have open board positions right now at your nonprofit, you can actually post them there as a member and get that out to the community and let folks know that you are looking for board members. Today, this session is a part of our Stronger Nonprofits framework. One of the essential pillars of a strong nonprofit, we know, is a high-performing leadership team. So that's that first pillar there. And you all as board members and leaders in the sector are part of that leadership team. So we just believe, that having this strong performing leadership team that is, really engaged and really committed to best practices and to being sustainable, that's going to make your organization so much stronger. So we thank you all for, again, just taking the time today to do a little bit of training and just keep yourselves really strong and effective as board members and leaders. And then, of course, just to share, we do have other events that are coming up. We have a grants event coming up at the end of this month, but also a couple of other board events. So we have one around diversity, equity, and inclusion and investing into that. That is part of our CLAY series, but it is actually open to others in other counties. And that one is particular to board and staff. So, if you're interested in that, please join us. And we also have our quarterly board roles and responsibilities coming up in May. So if you want a little bit more just focused directly on those other board roles and responsibilities, we do that quarterly as kind of an onboarding. You can share that with your board teams and let them know to take that session and increase their engagement there. All right, so I think that's it for my spiel. I'm so excited today to have David Stiers joining us. He is a senior governance consultant with a ton of really national and international experience. He has worked directly for BoardSource, which we all talk about so much here at the Nonprofit Center. We just love the resources that they provide the sector. So he is a senior governance consultant. He has been with them. He's also currently the director of learning and leadership programs with the League of American Orchestras in New York City. And he really just brings so much experience, 3 decades worth in facilitation and volunteer leadership, civic engagement, and has consulted with organizations across this country. So you're really, really in great hands today. And I'm so excited to welcome David Stiers. I'm going to go ahead and end my screen share and pass it over to David.
Great. Thank you so much, Callan. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. And I am actually joining you from my second home in Fort Lauderdale. And so I'm just south of you and have enjoyed during the pandemic to have the opportunity to become a resident of the state of Florida. And so it's a pleasure to be in the Sunshine State with all of you. And again, it's a great pleasure to be with you today. I'll put into the chat my cell phone number and my email address. Feel free to contact me at any time. As Callan said, I worked for 5 years on staff of BoardSource and has been a senior governance consultant for over a dozen years, working with nonprofits across the United States and around the world, and have worked in the nonprofit sector for 30 years, particularly with symphony orchestras and with volunteer organizations. And one of the joys of this work is the networking and getting to know wonderful people, including my colleague Jim Schwartz in Jacksonville, which some of you may know, who's also been a senior governance consultant with BoardSource. And it was through Jim that I got the connection to Callan to be with you today. So I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I may go ahead and turn off my video as well, in case that helps with our connection. But again, we have until 11 o'clock today. Feel free to put in the chat or Q&A, any questions you have. We will have time at the end for Q&A, but feel free to make sure that you get your questions and needs answered during this session, because that's what's most important for our time today. And I'm happy to stop and take questions anytime. And Callan set up some polls that we'll be looking for your feedback, but look forward to having a great opportunity to share information around financial oversight, a very important part of what a board does. And so to get started, sort of our learning outcomes for our time today is to look at how do we ask the right questions as board members to evaluate an organization's financial health, because a board doesn't know what a board doesn't know. And so how do we make sure that there is a financial literacy for the governance role of the board? And how do we identify various roles of the board and management and financial planning and oversight, and where each side falls in their responsibilities and what they do? And we recognize at BoardSource, when you've seen one board, you've seen one board, because every board is a little bit different. And so most of what I'm sharing is sort of geared to the idea of having some staff for the nonprofit, and then the board providing the financial oversight, as opposed to this being an all volunteer organization where the board is doing all of the work to run the organization. We also want to explore sort of financial management systems that help protect nonprofits, and most importantly, provide legal protection to board members. And then finally, sort of engage in some exercises in how to help the board set direction and oversee programs, which is what the finances are here all about. Because finances may not be the sexiest part of a nonprofits, but I see nonprofits fail in delivering on their mission when the board doesn't provide good oversight to their finances. And that can be one of the biggest stumbling blocks for successful nonprofits to be able to serve their communities. And having strong finances is important for any business, for profit or nonprofit. And so sort of again on our agenda, we'll look at the board's role in financial oversight. We'll talk about the committee structures that are involved in financial responsibilities. We'll be looking at financial management systems, again, that protect nonprofits. And then finally, this thinking strategically around the financial oversight and sustainability. And you'll see that some of these similarities with the board's role in fundraising. And again, they're both involved money. And many individuals have an innate discomfort with money and other financial topics, particularly when you're talking about the altruism and the good works that nonprofits do. Why muddy it with money? But I always say if there's no money, there is no mission. I have yet to see the nonprofit that runs on a zero budget, although some try to act like that sometimes. But again, it's important to have the financial resources to deliver on your programs and your mission for the community. And also another similarity with fundraising is that board members are asked to play this role of financial oversight, but they're not always trained to do so. Not every board member is an accountant or someone who may be a financial advisor or even comfortable with finances, but it's certainly a skill that is easily taught, and it can be a great learning opportunity for why someone would want to be a board member, because it can help improve their own financial literacy as well. And so again, when we talk about nonprofit organizations and corporate boards, there are some similarities, but also some major differences. And so while there's tens of millions of nonprofit for-profit corporations in the United States, there's only roughly about 1.5 million nonprofits. So it stands to reason that unique features of nonprofit finance may be lesser known. And again, on the board side, it's worth noting that boards of directors are mandated for nonprofit organizations. You can't have a nonprofit without a board, because this is part of that tax exempt organization that the IRS provides nonprofits, because they are subsidized by general public's tax monies. So the public, as well as individual donors and funders, have a right to expect that their tax-exempt nonprofit functions within its mission, follows all legal and ethical standards, and is efficient in its money management and transparent in how it operates, and discloses the operational and financial data to the public. And we'll talk about some of the ways that that happens. And ultimately, it is the board that is charged with the oversight of these functions and overseeing the finances. And again, it is important to note at least two things: that the standard rules and conventions for-profit managers rely on are reverse, or at best unreliable, in the nonprofit environment. So in the for-profit world, we talk about that growth almost always increases the need to have bigger organizations and bigger companies. But in nonprofits, that growth almost always increases the need for fundraising, and thus decreases self-sufficiencies. And also, for-profits always look at how do we create surpluses, but in nonprofits, the surpluses are still desired, but are invested back into the organization as opposed to given to stakeholders. And so particularly if you have board members who are coming from the corporate sector and who may have very little experience in the nonprofit sector, it's helpful to help them realize sort of the different mindset that a nonprofit has to have. The second thing is think about that in part due to the frequent restrictions on nonprofit income, that nonprofits run at least two businesses. That there's the core business related to the delivery of the mission, whether it's around healing people, teaching children, sheltering homeless, etc. And then there's the mission support business, and that's usually the finances, the fundraising, the operations. And that makes it unique for nonprofits as well, because again, this financial part falls into the overhead of nonprofits, which in some circles can be a dirty word. But again, a nonprofit has to have that overhead, has to have the financial systems in place in order to function effectively to deliver on the mission. Because at the end of the day, a nonprofit is a business. And actually, the language is the same, that your articles of incorporation creates a nonprofit corporate entity, not unlike a for-profit corporate entity. And so legally, you are a corporation. You're just a corporation that does not have shareholders and that invests your surpluses or profits back into the organization. And so when we look at how do we deliver on that mission, we do that through our programs, but we can't have effective programs without strong management, strong governance, strong administrative systems, and strong financial resources. Because if you remove any leg from this table, it will collapse. All four are incredibly important to make sure that those programs are as effective as possible, again, to ultimately deliver on that mission. And then when we think about nonprofits as well, it is a dual bottom line that not only are we looking for financial profitability as any for-profit company would, we're also looking for mission impact. And this is a great chart to think about the work that you do. And where you want to be is in the upper right-hand corner, where you're having high mission impact and high profitability. This is where you really want to invest and grow. There may be some things that have a high mission impact, but low profitability. These are things you may want to keep, but help contain the costs. These may be some lost leaders or things that are so critical to your community or only your nonprofit is delivering, even if they have a low profitability. These are the mission critical activities. You also may have some low mission impact, but high profitability activities. Again, the idea of these are the things you want to water and harvest and maybe help to increase the impact. These may be things like an annual gala or whatever fundraising events you may have. They may or may not be directly impacting your mission, but they may be bringing in the needed resources so that the bottom right corner helps balance out the upper left corner. Where you need to be careful is if you are doing things that have a low mission impact and a low profitability, those you need to sort of stop doing, either close or give away to another nonprofit. And these can often be legacy programs, things that have been going on for many years, and people have taken a less critical eye to them because, well, we've always done it. The question is, should we always be doing it? Or how could it be changed? And so you might think about all the different activities that your organization does and try to plot them into one of these four quadrants and see, how many would fall in each of these quadrants. And are there any things that fall in the bottom left that you could potentially stop doing to focus on things and move things up to the upper right? And again, feel free to ask questions at any time. I'm just trying to lay some background framework and then go into some more specifics about the governance role. So when we look at the board, we feel that certainly boards need committees. And so we'll talk about the board's role and we'll talk about some of the committee's roles. And we use this word when we talk about boards, fiduciary. It's not a word that we probably use in our common everyday language and chat. And it's an important role for nonprofit boards because each board member is a fiduciary and the board serves as the fiduciary for the organization. And it simply means the legal or an ethical relationship of trust between two or more parties. And so the fiduciary prudently takes care of the money for another person. So one party, for example, provides resources, and it could be, say, a corporate trust company or a trust department of a bank, and they act as fiduciary with the investments of those funds. And then in a fiduciary relationship, one person is in the position of providing their trust, providing good faith to the other person who is expected to protect and trust whatever they're being invested. And so this relationship requires a good conscience and to act at the sole benefit and interest of the one who puts their trust in you. And so again, the nonprofit is where the community is putting their trust, and why you have your tax exempt status is that you have said as a board that we will manage the funds donated to us and not have to pay taxes on this money because we are entrusted as fiduciaries for this organization. And then typically the full board then designates task groups or committees to help fulfill this fiduciary responsibility. And so these committees can make recommendations, but they are not binding. It's ultimately the board that has the liability and makes the ultimate determinations, as opposed to the individual committee members. And so it's really important for board members, particularly people who have never served on a nonprofit board, to understand this financial oversight role. And the first thing is understand the organization's finances itself. You know, what is in the budget and what are the guidelines for establishing the budget? What is the review of the financial condition of the organization? How do I read the financial statements? How do I understand what questions to be asking? And it's often board members will say, oh, well, other people on the board can take care of this. You know, I don't need to be an expert. But actually, every single board member needs to have some expertise in understanding the organization's financial statements, because at the end of the day, each individual board member is held equally liable for being that fiduciary for the organization. And particularly if for any reason the organization is sued, every single board member is sued individually. And just saying, oh, well, I didn't understand the finances doesn't let you off the hook. If anything, it makes you more liable. And so that's why it's so important for every single organization board member to have a clear picture of the organizational finances and understanding its financial picture, not just the executive committee or people who are on the finance or audit or investment committees, even though those individual committees can be important to help guide the board and its financial deliberations. Again, ultimately, it's the full board. And so that's why it's also important for every board member to understand the financial management systems. You know, what are our financial policies that we have in place? You know, what are we doing about an audit? What actions need to be taken? And so again, that's why having every board member understand this helps everyone to assess and minimize any risks, and then ultimately assess the financial performance of the organization and things like cash flow and investment policies, if you have an endowment. And so again, there's lots of different things around finances that board members need to understand. From, again, developing the budget and the resource development plan, again, understanding what resources are necessary to carry out a strategic plan, you know, and there may be a need to bring in a financial consultant to help with capitalization or a capital campaign or whatever it is that you're needing to make sure that you're providing the oversight for the organization that you are legally bound to do. I see there's a question, curious that you use the term profitability in the context of nonprofit organizations. Absolutely. Again, hopefully every organization is at least budgeting for a balanced budget. I know some organizations that for various reasons may do a deficit budget, but preferably that you're actually budgeting where you actually do have a surplus, that there's sort of a misnomer that nonprofits can't have a profit. And actually, that's why the term nonprofit itself is not completely accurate. And some people have tried to change the term to not for profit. It never really caught on. But the idea is that, yes, a nonprofit can have a profit and hopefully does. That's how you show a healthy, sustainable organization. The issue is what happens to that surplus, that profit. And again, in a for-profit company, it's provided back to the shareholders. And a nonprofit, it's reinvested into the organization. So that profit is what you could use to build a reserve fund, to increase your endowment, to start a new program, to potentially increase salaries for staff for retention, maybe to add new staff members to have added capacity. So absolutely every nonprofit needs to be profitable or they're not going to survive. And that profitability is critical to their sustainability and their ability to deliver on their mission in the in the community. So thank you for that comment. And so again, many people who serve on boards often serve because they're asked by someone who they know on the board already. And it may be someone who's also a major donor. But the issue is they may just think that the money magically appears, that there's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow and that the unicorn brings the money that we need to the organization. But it's really important, though, that this sort of idealized picture of the finances and just thinking, oh, we do such good work, of course the money will be there to support us, again, is a little bit of magical thinking, that we need to help board members understand that, you know, the money just doesn't magically appear, and that they need to think about all the different ways that money come into the organization, whether through individual donors, special events, grants from foundations or government, maybe corporate sponsorships. You may have some earned income programs, or maybe a service club component. And the big key here is diversity of funding. And sort of a rule of thumb always has been that you don't want more than 20% of your funding coming from one source. And I have worked with nonprofits that make it, you know, 80, 90% of their funding from maybe government grant or from a United Way or some other entity. And the biggest problem with that is if that source of funding disappears, your organization is really in bad shape. And so that's why, you know, you might be able to weather a 20% immediate drop if a funder disappeared. But how do you weather, you know, a 90% disappearance or even maybe 50%? And so it's really important in understanding organization finances for every board member to really understand where the money comes from. You know, find out, you know, if it's cash, is it investments, is it reserves, and how they align to short and long-term plans. And understand what drives your revenue. You know, help board members get an immediate and firm grip on all your revenue streams and what is and is not generally bringing in revenue. Again, that recent chart on the mission impact and the profitability. And also what type of revenue it is. Is it liquid cash that can be easily accessed? Or is it revenue that is in restricted funds or in an endowment fund that is not accessible easily? And so it's understanding the importance of the diversity of this funding stream, again, is really critical. And also, again, understanding how they align with your short-term and long-term plans. And this does not mean that cutting all non-revenue or negative revenue programs, but it does mean really seeing the whole picture of where the real costs are with really open eyes. And I often see that some executive directors like their boards wearing rose-colored glasses because it's not quite as scrutinizing and they don't feel quite under the pressure. And some board members like to be like ostriches with their heads in the sand. They don't really want to know all these details about the finances and the money. And so I think it's important that there can be no rose-colored glasses. Everyone has had their heads out of the sand to understand this. And again, just a rule of thumb I've seen is that 20% of your funding should come from no more than one source. And again, that there are different business models. I'm not saying that is always the case, but if you look at this actual chart, if the fundraising world, 80% of all fundraising comes from individuals. And so in philanthropy, it is not the government, it is not companies that are the major driver of giving in this country. It's individuals. And so if you're, say, having a very small percentage of your money coming from individuals, you may be losing out on a major pool of potential sources of revenue for your organization. Or if you only have one individual bankrolling your nonprofit, and that could be the case as well. But if that individual decides not to fund, I see another question, would you also agree that board members need to see the operations of the organization firsthand to fully appreciate and understand how the revenue is put to use in the execution programs? Yeah, so this is a little catch-22. You don't want board members to start micromanaging and getting into the weeds of the operations of the organization. But it is wonderful for board members to actually see the mission in action, be involved with as much as possible the programming of the organization so that they can have a sense of, the impact that it is making in the community. And so again, as long as you're not inviting board members to start micromanaging the operations of the staff, then absolutely getting board members accustomed to what is happening is really important. Again, it's also very important to assess, again, the cash availability. There's lots of market fluctuations. It's been a crazy 2 years for many nonprofits that, as horrible as the pandemic has been, many have been flush with cash. If they had great investments, the stock market went up, philanthropy kicked in, there were government grants, and it's actually been slightly a boom time in the midst of maybe not being able to deliver on services as they had liked. And they may have had less expenses than they normally would. The big concern that boards need to be thinking about from a financial lens is what comes next, because we've already tapped out all our major donors. Government funding is going to be drying up shortly. And so as challenging as FY21, FY22 have been, a lot of people fear that FY23, 24 can be even more challenging because of potential decline in the monies that have really supported many nonprofits during the past 2 years. And so really, again, having that diversified funding stream and having a really good financial advisor, people that can help pose the questions that your board needs to be thinking about and make sure that you are looking at the issues, because again, most board members are not financial experts. It's great if you can have them on your board, but again, that's not necessarily what every organization has. And again, just understanding those different revenue streams are so important, so that you can be maybe creative and thinking, oh, is there some sort of social enterprise that we could create that could bring in earned revenue and that could be unrestricted dollars, because that are the things that nonprofits want the most, the unrestricted. And I use the word earned income as opposed to contributed income. All income ultimately is earned. It takes a lot of work to bring in those donations and major gifts. But those are often called the earned income because it better called contributed income. And then the earned income would be maybe fee for service activities you may do, but also being sure that some of that earned income if it's not mission related, may be subject to tax. So again, there's always implications to think about when you're looking at what are the different ways we can bring money into our organization. When I think about what's the first thing a board needs to understand around their work and financial oversight, it is budgeting and financial reporting. And a lot of people think this is what the board does all the time, that when people think about what does a board do, well, they review the financial statements and hopefully they've approved the budget. And so it's important to think about, is the board understanding how the budget is put together? Because a lot of people say to know what a nonprofit does and the impact it's having in the community, you don't look at the website, you don't look at it, all the press releases and the PR, the Twitter account. Look at the budget. The budget tells the story of where the priorities of a nonprofit are and how they are spending their money. Again, is much more important in the old adage, put your money where your mouth is. And so it's really critical to think about where is your money going and are you budgeting effectively? And so what is your budget versus the actual revenue and expenses? What's the cash flow? What's the investment? What are asset allocations? Are there any debt payments? And so it's also important that budget to actual revenues and expenses are for both operating and capital expenditures. And that, again, having a financial advisor, particularly someone that has experience in investment performance and asset allocation, can be really critical. And this is really important when you're thinking about putting together new programs, expanding programs, acquiring property and equipment, making significant investments. It's hard to do any of that if you don't have really adequate financial information to support those types of decisions. And organizations can sink money into something that doesn't pay off as quickly as they planned, and that can potentially create a cash flow problem. And having the conversation as a board of, well, do we have a line of credit? I know some boards that absolutely have a line of credit in order to overcome cash flow problems. I also have other boards that refuse to take out a line of credit because they don't want to put the organization to debt and get to a point where they couldn't afford to pay the debt payments on a line of credit. So, and then there are organizations that get themselves into such financial states that they might need a line of credit, but not be able to get one. So having a really good relationship with a bank is critical for a nonprofit. So finding a bank that understands nonprofit finances and how they can be of a resource to you is very important. And so again, how you do this budgeting varies from organization to organization, but it's really important for the board to know what is in the budget. And so when we come to thinking about financial statements that your board of directors reviews regularly, is this one of our polls, Colin?
Yep, I'll launch that right now.
Great. So here's a poll. And so which of these financial statements does your board review regularly? Your annual budget, your budget to actual statements, your cash flow statements, your balance sheets, or any other that you'd like to add to the chat.
Right, I see we've got a lot of responses flooding in, so we'll give you a couple seconds there. We're at about half. All right, just a few more seconds maybe, and then we'll close it out. Okay, I think we're slowing down, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and we'll share the results out. All right.
Great, thank you, Colin. So as you can see, it's a little bit of a range. Importantly, and the 90 percentiles are the annual budget and the budget to actual statements. And then next comes the balance sheets, and then about 2/3 cash flow statements, and then some others that people review. And again, feel free to put those in the chat if there's anything in particular. And I see a comment from Rena about how important to have trusted relationship with a bank or credit union when organization applied for the PPP. Absolutely. Are there anybody you'd like to share, those who answered other? I think at least 3 people did, what those others were. Anyone who answered other would like to share?
Feel free to unmute.
This is Samantha Rogers from Seoul Jacksonville. Our board reviews the credit card statements and a cash flow report with our reimbursements to grants.
Okay, great. And again, you may have committee structures who go more in depth into any of these, but ultimately at the end of the day, the full board should have an understanding of what these are. And so again, it is the full board that should be approving the annual budget. It's the full board that should understand the budget to the actual statements and a sense of what the cash flow is and the balance sheet. And so whether you have this reviewed at every board meeting, depending on how often your board meets, but I would think at least quarterly, you would want to have these reviewed, and particularly like the budget approval process at the beginning of a fiscal year. And then as you're nearing the end of a fiscal year, understanding the budget to actual statements to knowing whether we're going to end the year in the red or are we going to end it in the black. And so again, that black means profitability. You really want to end it in the black. And so that's why utilizing the board as a resource to help provide guidance to the staff and finding board members who can provide that financial expertise. You may have individuals in your community, people who have MBAs or people who do have financial expertise often are asked to serve on financial committees when they serve on a board. And some of those people may not want to serve on a financial committee because they deal with finances all the time. But another idea I've seen many boards do is all new board members have to serve on the financial committee in their first year on the board. And that is partly to make sure that, particularly as new board members, they are getting well versed into the finances of the organization and understanding this role of the financial oversight. And I see other comments in the chat, having a financial dashboard that you prepare and share with the board. That is wonderful. The financial reporting can be pretty overwhelming, particularly for people who may not be used to reading lots of spreadsheets. So having some sort of dashboard where you can, through charts and graphs, present the information in a concise way is very helpful. Another other report is accounts receivable aging. Again, another call out for program budgets and dashboards as well. And a question of what all is included on your financial dashboards. I'd love for people who mentioned they have financial dashboards to share, what do you include on your financial dashboards? And then I'll get to the other question.
Hey, David, this is Rena. We use a dashboard, and it does change from year to year because it's based on some indicators that we think are the board needs to see every time, and then some that the finance committee thinks are key indicators of maybe a strategic goal that we're aiming for, or a particular fundraising campaign. So our dashboard may include unrestricted to restricted revenue based on if we have a goal for it. And then, as a membership organization, membership revenue year to year, those sorts of things. So it does change a little bit, but it's usually 4 or 5 big picture items that the Finance Committee recommends that the board focus on as a whole as key indicators of our economic health.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rena. Anyone else want to share what's on their dashboards? And thank you, Callan, if you have an example that you could share as a follow-up, that would be great.
This is, oh, sorry,
yeah, please,
David,
go
this
ahead.
is Sarah with Big Brothers Big Sisters Northeast Florida. We also have a comprehensive dashboard that has program, finance, and fund development. But the finance components that we share are actually our revenue categories, because we do have goals, strategic goals for the year. And so we have a, how we're performing against those percentage of distribution against those sources. And then we also have our budget category and our year-to-date actual and our variance to the budget listed out on our scorecard. And then we also have all of our bank accounts listed with our cash in hand in those bank accounts. So at a glance, we can kind of see what is our liquidity as an organization.
Great, thank you so much. Any other questions about dashboards? And that might be a whole training in and of itself about just putting together dashboards for your nonprofits, because you can dashboard anything, but financial dashboards can be really helpful to boards. There is the question about the FDIC insurance, since it's up to $250,000 in bank deposits. What if you exceed 250? Is that not insured? And should your nonprofit split the deposit into more than one bank? Anyone on the call, how have you dealt with this in your own organizations?
Hi, this is Trina from Jasmine. I just want to say that what we do is we do split into separate bank accounts. Unfortunately, we have more money, or fortunately, we have more money than bank accounts. So some of them do exceed 250,000. But what we do is we check the Bauer ratings for the banks every month. And we figure that if they have a high enough rating, then the risk is minimal.
I understand. And then Lori, you said you have a sweep account. Would you like to explain your sweep account?
I'm going to try, and I'm trying to get my video on. So we have been with Truist. They call it a sweep account. We're in the process of moving to Bank of America. They call it an EMA account. It doesn't get much interest, if any. But basically what happens is that all of your money sits in your bank account during the day, and the bank actually sweeps it into other bank accounts overnight, not to exceed 250,000 in any one bank. And that keeps it insured. It's a way for us to be able to have all our funds in our account and only have one bank to have to deal with, rather than have to reconcile multiple banks and keep, up to the minimum in different places.
That's great. Thank you, Lori. Again, have a conversation with your bank and other financial experts to see what recommendations they may have for your nonprofit. And again, they may have creative solutions like the sweep account that you may not even heard of or thought of. So that's why having those good relationships, as was mentioned earlier, is critical. And it's also why many nonprofits like to have someone from the banking industry on their board of directors. But again, anytime you have people from the financial sector on your board, you do need to think about any conflicts of interest that may entail, and just make sure that that person is recusing themselves for any votes that may or may not be involved with whatever financial institutions they may be associated with. Great. So a real key here is that board members need to stay sharp about all these different items that they need to be aware of. And so when I put a list like this up, do board members know about their D&O, their directors and officers insurance? And this is something that if board members don't, and potentially potential board members don't ask you, tell them, because again, a first-time board member may not understand directors and officers insurance and why it's important for a nonprofit to have that. And it's one of the first things that I know to ask if someone approaches me about serving on a board is, what is your directors and officers insurance? But again, a new board member may not think to ask that. And so again, it's important to have that policy. And most are around $1 million and cost about $600 per year. So, I mean, it's not a terribly big expense, but an incredibly important expense to have to protect your board members. And again, this is a separate policy from whatever general liability policy you have. And I often think it's important, maybe at least once a year, to bring in your insurance adjuster just to go over all the different insurances that the organization has, so that the board is aware of what insurance and what liability coverage the organization has out to safeguard the organization and also the board members. Again, the Form 990, that's important. One, because there's a requirement for an annual filing to the IRS, and it is a public document. And so having the full board approve the Form 990 is important, because you never want a board member to be stopped in the grocery store by someone making a comment about something they saw in your Form 990 and they'd be unaware of it. And so I often go to GuideStar, or now the organization Candid, and look at 990s of nonprofits just to see it is a snapshot of time of what was going on with that nonprofit that year, and particularly around their finances. Again, the conflict of interest just mentioned is important to implement and enforce an annual conflict of interest policy. And again, something that is just important to make sure that you're maintaining your legal duties of care, loyalty, and obedience to the organization, particularly that duty of loyalty as through the conflict of interest. And again, it's not that you're going to avoid every conflict of interest, but you will manage the conflicts of interest as they come up. Again, whether or not you need to do an annual audit or at least a review is something important for the board to consider. Sort of best practice, and in the state of California, state law, if a nonprofit has over $2 million, they have to do an annual audit review and have a separate audit committee from their finance committee. And again, it's just something to think about. So particularly if your organization is over 2 million, is your audit committee completely separate from your finance committee? And are you doing an annual audit? Again, to save some costs, your organization may just be able to do a review and do an audit maybe every 2 years, because a review is less intensive and usually costs less money. Again, your credit standing, how are you maintaining good credit and financial standing for the nonprofit? And then just being mindful of any red flags. What are warning signs that board members should be thinking about? And the worst thing is if a board member thinks he sees or she sees a red flag and says nothing. And so it's important to make sure that that board members speak up if they see a red flag, and it may be something that other people aren't noticing. And I've seen red flags such as that they keep drawing money out of the endowment to cover operating deficits. Well, you can only do that so many years before you will run out of the endowment. And I saw a nonprofit that had $1 million endowment. A new executive director came in, and to cover operating deficits of around $200,000 a year, he just kept drawing out the endowment. Well, after 5 years, there was no more endowment left. And the organization actually went under because they did not have a clear sense of a business model of profitability without having that endowment to cover their operating deficit. So again, important to raise those red flags when they're seen. So we mentioned the Form 990, and Colin, do we have another poll for this question? Does your board review your RS 990 as a full board?
Yes, we do. I'm opening that right now.
Great.
All right, let's see, we're at about half, so a couple more seconds there. Okay. Take 4 more seconds. Last couple folks that want to respond. All right, that looks like the majority. I'll go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
Great. Well, we only have about 3/4 that actually do have the full board review the 990, and about 16% said not sure, and 8% said no. And so again, it's really critical to actually have the full board review the 990, because this is a public statement. If you haven't been on GuideStar lately to look at your own 990, and often many organizations, because it is a public document, post their 990s on their own websites. So that, again, part of that financial transparency and open fiduciary responsibility to the community. And I know of some organizations that have actually started posting their financial dashboards on their own websites so that the general public and donors can see what the board is seeing. And often, if your financial condition is very good, it can be very encouraging for people to give money to an organization. And some people feel like, oh, well, if we show that our nonprofit has lots of money, why will people give to it? And again, people like to give to success. And so if someone sees that an organization is managing their funds really well and providing great resources to the community, they're more likely to give to your organization. I've never found the appeal letter, we're about ready to go out of business, send money today, very successful in nonprofit fundraising, although I have received those appeal letters. And so again, the more you can show, and again, your 990 is a great picture of this, your prudence and your oversight of your finances, the more confidence people will have in giving you money as well. And that's why this Form 990 is so important. And it's so important to make sure that you are filing it annually so that you are not penalized by the IRS in your reporting. And again, showing your transparency to the general public as well. And we are going to be sharing the PowerPoint after the presentation. So even if you need to jump off early, we will definitely make sure that you get that. So again, one of the critical roles of the board is how do they assess the financial performance of the organization? And again, a lot of this financial language may be a new frontier for many board members, but close monitoring is key. And again, this is a teachable skill. You know, someone may have never taken accounting in college, but these are things that they can learn. So terms like liquidity, you know, this simply refers to the ability to convert assets into cash. And typically it's under 30 days. Your revenue and expense activity, and what's the diversification? What are your significant investments and your policies and strategies around investments? What are in your reserves, or often called a rainy day fund? And what are your policies around reserves? What are your donor compliance, particularly for those restricted grants? And then there's the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, which is a big word that is simply an act that's been adopted in many states that really just codifies the requirement that charities invest prudently and encourages diversification of investment portfolios in a way that's more progressive than old laws that apply to charity investments. So this just says that, you know, you're not investing in one board member's company only, that you're really being prudent in how you're doing the investments. And so that is what that act is for. But again, one of the key things in here is, again, that liquidity. How much cash do we have on hand, or can we get on hand? The idea of diversification, knowing, again, as we talked earlier, all the different sources of revenue, the investments, and some organizations have investment committees to help with that, because if you do have cash, how can you make that cash be earning money for you? And particularly if it's an endowment, often organizations look for 5 to 10% return on their endowment, and that interest and investment revenue can be invested back in the organization. So if you have $1 million endowment, you know, that's $50,000 that is almost guaranteed money every year, and could be up to 100,000 that can go in as revenue for the budget. And then the reserves and the reserve policies. There's no hard, fast rule on this, but just like it's not good to live paycheck to paycheck as an individual, organizations should have some sort of savings account, some sort of reserve, rainy day fund. And the idea is that if you got no more money in the door, how long could the operations continue with what's in reserve? And even during the pandemic, some people were concerned about pulling down their reserves, but it's like, well, that's what they're there for. And a general sort of minimum is around 2 months. And if you can get up to 4 months or even 6 months of reserves, that really is a healthy financial situation that you could really weather something horrific happening, like a pandemic or something else, maybe a natural disaster, so that there is an ability for the organization to be able to survive. And again, the pandemic wiped out many galas, which were major fundraisers. In a state like Florida, we might have a hurricane the weekend of your biggest fundraising event. And so how do you make sure you have reserves to help overcome that? And again, guidelines of 2 months, 4 months, 6 months are just things I've seen helpful. I say, Gary, thank you for saying you target 3 to 6 months, as does Rena. That is great. And so the question of what percentage months of cash reserve put in. And one of the ways that organizations build their cash reserves is through that profitability. So you actually budget to have surplus at the end of the year, with the understanding is that surplus will go into building up reserves. And particularly if you've had to draw down from your reserves, how are you budgeting to fill those reserves in the future? And so that's why, yes, many organizations did have to go into their reserves in the past 2 years, rightly so. And now, how do we potentially put money back into these reserves as well? Again, things like reserves, not sexy, but so important for the sustainability of a nonprofit. And again, you could even designate the endowment revenue from investments to go into reserves as well, as opposed to programs, if that would be another place that you could get money. Because it's hard to fundraise for reserves. A little bit easier maybe to fundraise for endowments. But again, thinking about how do you have other opportunities for giving beyond just your program, particularly for major gifts and bequests. So let's talk about all the different committees and how they relate to the full board. So nearly every nonprofit I've worked with has some sort of finance committee. And this is the committee that usually is chaired by the treasurer of the board. Often, if there is some finance director of the nonprofit, that person staffs that committee or with the executive director. And this committee really looks at putting together those fiscal policies, doing the first cut of the budgeting process before presenting to the full board, really looks to anticipate any financial problems, is there to help educate the board. And again, board education is so critical, particularly around these financial issues, and they ensure the reporting requirement. So making sure that the 990 is filed every year with the IRS, for example. And so again, having that finance committee can be one of the most important committees of the board, and why many nonprofits, as I said, have new board members have to serve on the finance committee in their first year to really get to understand the organization from the inside out. Some nonprofits combine the finance and audit committee or have a separate audit committee that have maybe some overlap. But again, best practice is if your audit committee can be completely separate from your finance committee to be a complete check and balance. And the audit committee, again, reviews and approves the audit reports, manages the scope of the audit, selects the external firm to provide the audit, really ensures compliance and reporting, and again, is also often responsible for the review of the 990. And again, the audit committee needs to run the audit, and the board, even if you don't have an audit committee, needs to run the audit. This is, again, part of the check and balances with the staff. I've sometimes seen nonprofits just say to the staff, well, you know the finances, you work with the auditors. And yes, the staff has to work with auditors to provide the information, but the full board is responsible for the audit. And I always am concerned if there is not an audit report by the auditor to the full board, and maybe without staff present, maybe it's an executive session, so that the full board gets a true financial picture and an unbiased financial picture as well of the organization. Because again, nonprofits struggle most when financial issues have been hidden, where people have been charged with fraud because staff have cooked the books, to use the expression, and been able to keep the board in the dark about what are the financial realities of the organization. And so that audit, or at least a review, can help make sure that you're getting a clear picture and hopefully an unqualified audit at the end of the day. And that's really important for certainly fundraising as well. You, again, may have a separate investment committee that oversees the organization's investments and it selects or oversees any external investment advisors. And this, again, should comprise individuals knowledgeable about investments. And depending on your bylaws, as long as you can have non-board members as members of these committees, that this is a great way that even if you don't have full board members with this financial expertise or investment expertise, bring in people from the community as just committee members, even if they're not on the board. And that can help build your bench strength and provide you additional support for the work of these committees. Because ultimately, finally, it's the full board, again, who has the legal responsibility for the financial success of the organization and needs to be preparing for the meetings, reviewing the financial statements as part of the duty of care, disclosing conflicts of interest, again, that duty of loyalty, and then maintaining financial fidelity is that duty of obedience for the organization. And question from Gary, curious how many have a separate audit committee? So again, in state of California, you're required to if your budget is over $2 million. I see Rena has one and they're under 1 million. So again, feel free to put in the chat or speak up if you have a separate audit committee. Again, it's considered a best practice and it may be an aspiration to be working towards for your nonprofit if you don't have one already. And again, having these committees and task forces can really benefit from direct staff input, particularly if you have staff with financial expertise, if you have a chief financial officer or a director of finance or a controller, and then often the chief executive is the staff person assigned to help provide the background information the committee needs, to help with operational work and administrative tasks. And again, you don't want to overwhelm staff with too many unreasonable requests because they have their own jobs to accomplish, but boards get the information they deserve. And so hopefully staff know what information they need to be providing to boards, but if a board isn't getting the information they think they need, then they need to be asking for it. And so I think that that's critical to have that conversation. And again, you don't want a board member sitting there thinking, boy, I wish I could see X report. Ask for X report. You are the board. And maybe it's, oh, maybe we can put it into a dashboard. I see some other responses that have the audit combined with the finance or fiscal committee idea that does finance, audit, and investment. Again, most nonprofits I know do have it combined. And again, when the state of California passed their law almost probably 15 years ago, there was a sense that, you know, the rest of the country might follow suit, and they really haven't. I don't know of any other state that passed a similar law to California, but that's seen somewhat as the best practice then set by that standard. And so again, form needs to follow function. So think about what functions you need to have happen and whether your committees are structured to do that. And look also in your bylaws about what committees are or are not the bylaws. So I actually think nonprofits can hamstring themselves if they actually put their committee structures in their bylaws, because then if you don't have that committee, you are out of compliance with your bylaws. Or if you want to start a new committee, but it's not in the bylaws, you have to change the bylaws. So I actually like bylaws simply to say, you know, we will impanel committees to do the work of the board. The one committee that should be in the bylaws is the executive committee with a limit of its powers if you do have an executive committee. But again, maybe even reviewing your committee structure would be an important activity to do. And almost like if you do zero-based budgeting, so if you start out and say, okay, we have $0, what do we want to do and how much money will it take to do it? You can do zero-based committees. What if we had 0 committees today? What do we need a committee structure to do? And what would that structure look like, as opposed to just being locked into, well, we've always had this committee structure. Again, just like we've always had previous programs, how do we keep things fresh moving forwards? Again, thinking about these individual committees and what they focus on. Again, the finance committee is really there to safeguard the organization's assets, to draft organizational fiscal policies, to really ensure adequate funds are available for planned activities, to anticipate financial problems, to ensure that the board receives adequate and complete information, to really help the board understand financial statements and the financial situation of the organization, and to ensure that federal, state, and local reporting takes place. So all of that is so important because your finances tell a story about your nonprofit. And so the finance committee regularly oversees the proper performance of the financial operations of the nonprofit and reviewing all financial activity. And some organizations may have a separate budget committee or budget task force, but again, ultimately it's that finance committee that reviews and discusses the budget with management before the presentation to the full board, and then provides that in-depth review of all the different accounts, the spending, and the different practices of the organization. So again, having financial expertise is critical on this committee, preferably in the treasurer, who's the chair. But again, bringing outside help is important too. And then the audit committee, again, if it is separate or made part of the finance committee, they again review and approve the reports related to the organizational audits. They manage the scope of the audit. They select and meet in closed session without staff, the external firm to provide the audit. They ensures the compliance with all reporting requirements. And again, this is the committee's primary function is to accept and review the reports provided by external auditors and to select that audit firm for the next year's audit. And it is also good practice to change audit firms ever so often. So every 3 to 6 years, put out to bid to find a new audit firm, again, so that you get that fresh perspective and fresh voices as well. And again, this is all about helping to make sure that there's independent oversight of the nonprofit. And the entity within a state that oversees nonprofits is actually the Attorney General's office. And it is the worst thing to get a letter from the Attorney General, because often that means they have received a complaint about the nonprofit and maybe how it's managing its resources. And then that is when, I see nonprofits making the newspaper and above the fold headlines for the worst reasons. Sadly, nonprofits are never in the newspaper for all the good work they do, but the 1 or 2 nonprofits that can get into the newspaper are usually when an Attorney General investigation comes into play around how they're managing the finances. And then finally, we mentioned the investment committee, again, overseeing the investment strategies, liaisoning with any outside investment advisors, and adhering to whatever policies that the organization has put forward around their investments. And so that's sort of the committee structures that are necessary to maintain your financial oversight. And now I want to talk about some ways to protect your organizations, particularly in terms of, in addition to the external audits, the internal controls and the accounting policies and procedures. And the comment about lessons learned from the advice of the Trump Foundation. Well, and foundations are a different type of nonprofit as well. I think there'll be lots of lessons that come out of those. But if you just Google nonprofit financial scandal or something like that, you will find lots of different organizations that have come under scrutiny and attorney generals. Some states have more activist attorney generals than others, and many states have more nonprofits than others, but there's lots of different scandals that you can find about different nonprofits and lessons learned. Yes, and you will get a copy of the PowerPoint emailed to you. So in talking about controls, one of the first are internal controls. And this is where you segregate financial duties, you protect against asset loss, you protect your cash receipts, you require second signatures on large checks, you keep track of your inventory, you require efficient bidding processes, you produce timely reports, you maintain accurate record keeping, you have supervisor approval of reimbursements, all the different things that help to make sure that people are not skimming money or not embezzling from the organization or spending money properly. And the sad thing is, even with some good internal controls, people can work around them. And if you have weak internal controls, it's easy to work around them. And again, sadly, there are those individuals who have stolen money from nonprofits. And so having these strong internal controls and board oversight is really critical. And so again, in segregating the duties, it's really important to have strong controls, again, around employee or volunteer expense reimbursements, or having custody of petty cash or other cash funds, maintaining records of accounts owed, approving purchases, and having access to computer programs used to maintain accounting records, and reconciling bank and investment accounts and maintaining basic accounting records. And so above all else, sort of the tone at the top is one of the most important elements of internal controls, and making it clear to all employees, and particularly in the orientation for new employees, that the organization takes seriously its fiduciary responsibilities, and that violation of control processes could lead to their dismissal. And I mean, it's not to scare people, but it's also to make it clear that, just because we're a nonprofit doesn't mean that we're lax on things like internal controls. And this is where the adage, well, a nonprofit needs to run like a business, does somewhat play in, because we also have in the business for-profit world plenty of scandals of embezzlement and financial impropriety. And it's even worse though in the nonprofit sector, because it's individual donor funds that are being embezzled, or grant funding. So that's why having these good controls can really be critical as acting as a deterrent, and to detect problems very quickly when they arise, so that if there is malfeasance going on, that is caught as quickly as possible. And so again, just some practical tips. Someone said about reviewing credit card statements. It's especially good to have a board member review the executive director's expense reimbursements and their credit card activity, because ultimately the board is the supervisor of the executive director. And just like each supervisor on staff should be reviewing any reports of reimbursement from their staff members. And I know some nonprofits have done away with credit cards for staff just because of the risk involved, and having someone, even though a credit card might be more efficient for getting business done. Again, depending on the scope of the organization or other financial policies, consider requiring that certain internal management controls be established and viewed annually. Again, in managing funds, the board generally delegates that day-to-day control to the staff. Again, the board should still keep control over any borrowing of money, because again, excessive borrowing is not in the interest of the organization, and again, could reflect that lack of sufficient financial controls. Again, the board needs to review the organization's financial policies and procedures regularly. And again, that could be done by an audit or finance committee. And then the board ultimately approves and establishes any credit card accounts for the organization. And again, those can be one of the ways that organizations get tripped up the most. So again, all these are just helpful tips to make sure that your internal controls are effective. And then there, in addition to the internal controls, other accounting policies and procedures about making sure that your accounting manuals are prepared properly, because two of your most important documents are the written policies and procedures of the accounting staff, that really contains the guidelines for processing transactions and maintaining good internal controls. And then also your investment policies of how the organization should have procedures for safeguarding cash, for ensuring its liquidity, and for employing it productively at all times. And again, together, these procedures form the cash management elements of the organization's investment policies, because no individual staff member or volunteer should have sole responsibility for selecting investments or making these policies. But again, it should be the board's collective wisdom that really ensures that the organization abides by board approved investment and policies. And so again, some of the questions, some of the practical tips around these are, again, when determining investment goals, take short-term and long-term goals in consideration. what is the purpose of the specific funds in terms of growth, liquidity, or security, and the level of acceptable risk. I know individual saving accounts have not drawn hardly any interest of late. And then, so what's your investment policy of doing CDs, for example? And how many years is the CD and what's the return? But you lose the liquidity of that money when it's in the CD. And then also thinking about when the CD matures, what would you do with that money? Do you reinvestment? Do you take the interest, etc.? And again, and that's all about diversifying the portfolio and considering different types of investments, whether stock, bonds, and then also different classes, whether corporate versus US Treasury, large, medium, or small companies, different industries, et cetera. So that's why having that investment advisor is helpful. And then also considering social responsibility. And there are some organizations that want to restrict their investment activity in areas that may be alcoholic beverages, tobacco, firearms, or other potentially controversial industries. Even board members working in some of those industries have caused controversy within organizations as well. And where your money is invested. So for example, back when South Africa still had apartheid, many nonprofits were upset if they found out that their money was invested in South African companies, for example. And so again, knowing not only what your investment policies are and how much, but where is the investment can be important to track as well. So some of the financial oversight questions that your board should be asking, particularly they don't know, is around your revenue. You know, what are our current revenue streams, and are they sustainable in the next years, maybe 2 years, 5 years? And particularly right now, a lot of organizations have been doing scenario planning where they're not just doing an annual budget. They're thinking about, okay, what should I be budgeting next year and 2 years from now and 3 years now, and projecting cash flow. And so again, that understanding the revenue is very critical. And then around the operating results, you know, how might changes in revenue streams affect our operations? What might we need to change? You know, staffing has been, you know, the #1 expense for any nonprofit. Usually 50% of a budget on average is to cover staff salaries. And so when the pandemic hit, that was the place where people had to cut either through furloughs or layoffs. And so again, being able to understand how you might manage that, or organizations pulled out money from the reserves and maintained their staffing. So again, having that conversation as a board is important. Again, having a healthy balance sheet and understanding changes in the balance sheet is important to monitor. Again, that idea of liquidity, and you know, how quickly can anything be converted to cash? And then the expenses, what are the true costs for each program? And program costs is both the direct expenses as well as the staff time. And so understanding all of that, and does the revenue cover both of those sides of program costs? Again, we talk about, you know, the amount of cash that you want to have in your reserves to provide in a rainy day fund. Do you want to have a line of credit? And what percentage can be utilized? If you're going to have a surplus this year, how will it be invested, or how will it be used? And so here's another poll question about your audits and reviews. How often does your audit organization conduct an audit or review?
All right, that's launched, and let's see, we have about a third.
And again, the main thing is to really understand your internal controls, having the checks and balances in place, having the segregated duties, having adequate documentation, investment policies. That's what the auditors are looking for.
All right, it looks like we've slowed down, so I'll go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
And not surprisingly, nearly everyone does an annual audit. And for those of you who don't know, ask at the next board meeting or find out what is the frequency of your audits. And again, if you can budget and afford to do an audit every year, that is great. And getting that unqualified audit is a great signal that you are in good financial health and people should trust to give their money to you. And again, in that audit and review process, again, these are the documents that board members should receive and be already familiar with, from the balance sheet, which shows a point in time, the income statement, the statement of cash flow, and the statement of financial expenses, which show a time range. And again, simply the audit process is to making sure that certified public accountants form an opinion on whether the organization's financial statements fairly reflect its financial position, the changes in its net assets and its cash flow. And again, this is just something that it's important that as a way to have external validation of the financial health of the nonprofit. So our final thing I want to discuss was thinking strategically. And this relates to finances and how are you going to spend the money? And having a written strategic plan, I think, is something that is important. And also having it created and reviewed by the full board. And Colin, did you set up a poll for this question as well?
Apologies, no, I don't have a poll.
No, that's fine. This is somewhat rhetorical. That's why I just wanted to ask. And so again, what a strategic plan looks like can be different from organization to organization. And the sort of newest thinking is having a more short-term strategic framework that really gives direction, sort of the old business of spending, 12, 18 months putting together a 3 to 5 year strategic plan can be a little bit daunting and not terribly timely. And so what I'm seeing organizations doing much more nowadays is spending 6 months putting together a strategic framework that gives the direction of the goals and objectives, maybe over the course of maybe 2 to 5 years still, but thinking about also what is the budget that we need to fulfill that strategic plan, because the strategic plan is only as helpful as the paper it's on if there isn't money to actually fund it. And I've seen people at the end of a 3-year strategic plan look back and say, wow, that was really great what we came up 3 years ago, but since we never had the financial resources to implement it, it's a shame that all these great ideas were for naught. And so making sure that that strategic plan helps inform your budgeting process, and then that the board uses it in their oversight of the staff and its work plans and holds themselves accountable for the strategic plan to be implemented. And so again, in putting together whatever strategic plan or strategic framework, it's usually around a 4-step process where you do some sort of environmental assessment of where are we now. You think about your organizational direction, of where you should want to go. Often that's in a retreat setting. You pull together your strategy of how do you want to get there and the documentation, and then you finally do the planning imputation. How will we make it happen? And again, examining these goals and strategies ongoing is really critical to really think about what is it that we have said we want to do and are we doing it? It's sort of like Alice in Wonderland meeting the Cheshire Cat. You may remember their first encounter is at a fork in the road, and she asked the Cheshire Cat which fork to go down. And he says, well, where do you want to go? And she said, well, I don't know. And then he says, well, it doesn't matter which fork you go down. And so if you don't have a clear sense of what direction you're wanting to move, then it's really hard to know, are we going the right way? Are we doing the right things? And so again, having that strategic thinking, that strategic plan can be really important. And certainly no one had in their strategic plan deal with the greatest pandemic in 100 years in 2020. And so every strategic plan needs to have a good bit of flexibility in it, because new things do happen, unexpected changes occur. But again, having that roadmap can really help you to know how to navigate when those changes occur. And so it's sort of like when you hit a detour, if you have no map, you don't know which way to go when a roadblock happens. Well, the strategic plan can help you get back onto a track that's similar to the direction you're wanting to go. And so there are times not to do a strategic plan and times to do them. And some people put off strategic planning thinking there's never a good time. And so you ultimately have to think about when do we need to do it? So it's best to do it when there's organizational stability. If you have an existing plan that's already expired or is expiring, that's a good time to think about what's the next plan. If you know that the board and the executive director are clear about how they want to approach the strategic planning process, is the timing right for a strategic plan? Typically, if there's transitions happen and there's pros and cons, like if you need to do a strategic plan and there's a transition in the CEO, some people want to do the strategic plan before the CEO departs so the board knows who they're looking for. Other boards may decide, no, we want to hire the new CEO and have him or her involved in the strategic planning process, since they will have to be leading strategic plan. I mean, there's pros and cons both ways, but thinking about the timing, coming up with the funding to do a strategic planning process and how you're going to do it, and typically hiring external expertise to help do it, putting together a board and staff committee and having their commitment to do the strategic planning. And again, and the organization willing to be challenged and participate in a facilitated process. And so the strategic planning process, again, starts with that discovery, getting the feedback, document review, looking at where you are in your organizational life cycle, scanning the environment, thinking about best practices with other organizations and coming up with your priorities. Retreats are a great opportunity to think strategically and to focus beyond just the day-to-day. And I have actually would have said 2 years ago, could you do a strategic planning process without an in-person retreat? I'd have said no, but I have actually done 2 strategic planning processes completely virtually during the pandemic. And so Zoom, like we're doing right now, can be a powerful tool to help bring people together, even if you can't be meeting in personally, getting all the documentation together, and then figuring out the implementation of strategic plan is so important. And so a question about how to evaluate successes or failures. So Stephen, would you like to sort of elaborate more on that question? If you can unmute yourself.
Yes, Stephen, if you can't unmute yourself, feel free to drop it in the chat and we can circle back to it in just a moment.
Because I'm presuming you're talking about success and failures maybe of the previous strategic plan or where the organization is now. And so certainly as part of that discovery process, there should be a conversation about what have we been doing really well. But I really like to have people focus on what have been high point moments? What have been great moments of success? When have we been most proud of the organization? And think about what does that tell us about our strengths? And building from those, what are our wishes for the future? And so certainly, again, the worst thing about strategic planning is the document gets put on a shelf. And the best thing about strategic planning is that that document can really be such a valuable guide, and not only helping you understand what the organization does best, or at least does well, what are some things that, maybe we thought were important, but really aren't in our wheelhouse, that we should maybe let other organizations do that we don't do as well. And so that strategic plan can really help the organization prioritize and the board think about what is the best way to move the work forward. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, strategic planning processes are about asking questions and asking the right questions about starting with the why. Why is it important right now? Why should we consider other options? Why do we do what we do? Then thinking about the how of what does this serve our mission? How does it fit our strategic goals? And then the what is our capacity, and what does success look like? Some of you may be familiar with Simon Sinek's Golden Circle. There's a wonderful TED Talk that you can find on YouTube at Simon, S-I-M-O-N, Sinek, S-I-N-E-C, or just Google Golden Circle, where he talks about many organizations focus on the what they do and all the activities. And he has found that actually the most successful organizations really focus on the why do we do this? And so again, we can get caught up on the day-to-day what, but miss the strategic why. And then the strategic plan serves as sort of the how do we want to bridge the why to the what. So I would love to, in our last sort of 15 minutes together, to take any questions that you may have, any other thoughts or reactions that may be coming up that you would like to either ask of me or ask of your colleagues. Feel free to unmute yourself. Oh, thank you, Colin, for fitting in the Simon Sinek TED Talk. And again, I wanted to leave a little bit of time at the end in case there was anything people wanted to delve any deeper on. I know we've covered a lot of information in the past hour and a half or so. And again, you'll get the PowerPoint to be able to follow up. I will put again into the chat my telephone number and my email. Feel free to follow up with me directly if you have any questions. I always am happy to answer anything or provide any advice that I can for anyone who've attended any of my trainings. So, okay, so the success and failures of the strategic plan. Absolutely. So I think it's very important before starting a new process to decide what about the old or previous process, if you had one, was good and what was bad. What is it that would have been helpful as you move forward into the next process? So certainly, yes, absolutely. What about both the process of the previous strategic plan and also the plan itself? You may have come up with 4 goals and each goal had 3 objectives, whether it was 2, 3, 5 years later, how well did you achieve it? And this is where having the strategic plan as part of your board meeting agenda, and actually you could construct your board meeting agenda based on your strategic plan. And I've even seen some nonprofits create committees of the board to really be accountable for making sure the implementation of the strategic plan happens. The conversation around the board is really around the direction of the organization and where it's going. Because many board meetings, particularly when we're looking at finances, are backwards looking. We're looking in the rearview mirror or where we have been, but also board meetings need to be forward looking of how do we want to be anticipating the future and planning for it as well. And one thing about all the financial statements and dashboards is that, again, it can be overwhelming. It can take a lot of time. And it can also take up, for some boards, the majority of when they come together for meetings. And so if you can provide the training to your board about what they're looking at, provide them those clear dashboards, and send everything out in advance of the board meeting, I'm now seeing if your board uses a consent agenda where you put things in the consent agenda that are routine business that can be approved at one time around executive director reports, a chair report, committee reports. I'm actually seeing financial reports put in the consent agenda as well, so that you free up time in the board meeting to have more substantive conversations than just having people sit and look through spreadsheets. And you do have to get the materials put together. I usually like to see them sent out at least a week in advance. And you have to trust that your board members will review them prior to the meeting, because sharing information in a meeting is very inefficient. The best part about a meeting is getting together and having discussion. And even on a consent agenda, someone could pull something out of the consent agenda. So if they do have a question about something in the financial reports, that could lead to conversations, or if there's a specific item of the financial report. But this can save a lot of time than spending the bulk of a meeting going through the financial reports. Question about what would be some examples of an agenda structured around strategic planning. So I'm working with an organization right now, and their strategic plan has 4 goals. And the first goal is around community engagement. The second goal is around their programming focus areas. The third goal is around their philanthropic fundraising. And their fourth goal is around organizational development. And each goal has several objectives under each. And so you could actually structure a board meeting agenda based on those 4 goals, where you have a conversation about what are we doing in community engagement in terms of assessing the needs of the community, being aware of what other organizations are doing, and being advocates for maybe policy changes that would help advance our mission. Again, the programmatic oversight is another responsibility of a board in addition to their financial oversight, but I often find that programs get very short shifted at board meetings. And so if you have programmatic strategic goals that, the mission area is why people join nonprofits. I have never met a board member who said, I joined a nonprofit board because I love reading financial statements, or I want to know about the auditing process for this nonprofit. No, they join a nonprofit because they have a passion for the mission. But how much of our board meetings do we actually spend talking about the delivery of our mission and the programs that we provide? And so that could be an agenda item, and having these mission moments during board meetings where you may bring in a spokesperson or a speaker from someone that you have impacted, brought in a funder of why they gave you money, even just read a thank you note can be a very powerful thing to do in a board meeting. And it may seem like a waste of time, but it actually can help make the time you're together more effective, because it really centers the board around why we are here, our mission. Again, having an agenda item around your revenue and fundraising, and what strategies around your branding, around community outreach, always a great conversation for a board to have. And then organizational development, talking about those internal controls. Are there IT upgrades that are needed? again, investment in people, investment in financial operations. And so that would be one way you could structure an agenda based on the strategic planning goals. And it also helps keep a strategic plan alive so that it's not just a check the box at the end of the process, but it's like, oh yeah, we said we wanted to be accomplishing these things. That's easily to remind on every board meeting if that strategic plan lives within that board agenda as well. Because the other thing, when you're thinking about your board agenda, if your board agenda has looked the same over the past several years, that could be problematic. Or if you could take your name off the top of your board agenda and put in any other nonprofit's name and no one would notice, that's problematic. Because I often see agendas just say, welcome, approval of minutes, old business, new business, adjourn. And yeah, that's easy to reproduce every time the board gets together, but it really isn't moving things forward or telling me about what this organization is focused on. And so just even putting your mission statement on the top of any agenda, on the top of your financial statement, so that that mission statement is omnipresent. I've seen it framed, engraved on the wall. Don't chisel it on your wall because mission statements do change over time, but just always having that mission statement visible so that every decision we're making around our strategic planning, around our finances, investments, audits, yes, this is unsexy, but at the end of the day, it's because we're doing the things right in our investments and our audits and our financial planning that makes this mission possible. And so that's why keeping that mission so critically clear. Even I've seen boards that do nameplates so that if your name is visible on the front of a tent card, the mission statement is printed on the back of the tent card. So again, it's everywhere you're looking, you're seeing that mission, because that is why you are there, serving as a board member, worrying about all these money issues, dealing with all these regulations, filing that 990. At the end of the day, it is the mission that is driving all of this.
I have a question about.
Yes, Steve.
Yeah, I have a question about the makeup of a finance committee. I'm with Week here. We currently don't have a accountant on our board. However, I've developed a person who would be willing to serve on our finance committee. Do they necessarily have to be a board member?
As long as your bylaws do not stipulate it. So if your bylaws say that every committee member has to be a board member, yes, then they would have to be a board member. But hopefully your bylaws don't say that. And it's a wonderful practice then to be able to bring on an accountant to your finance committee, and their performance on your finance committee may cause you to think, wow, they would make a great board member, or they may think, oh, I would love to be a board member. So having a non-board member on any of the committees can be a great test drive for that individual, because if they don't perform well as a committee member, they're not going to perform well probably as a board member. And it helps them get to know the organization before they take the step of the fiduciary legal responsibility of becoming a full board member as well.
Thank you.
And their own personal life, they may not feel like they can commit the time at this moment to being a full board member, but serving on the finance committee is something they could easily do. And again, it's a great volunteer position for people to be able to provide their expertise back to an organization whose mission they care a lot about. Any other questions or comments in our last 5 minutes? And I know that Colin has put in the evaluation, so please complete the SurveyMonkey form for the evaluation for today's session.
I was going to ask just one question myself,
Yeah, please, Colin.
If people feel like there is a red flag, and they're concerned about something in the financials, what exactly should be their first step?
So So if you are simply a board member, then you might want to first go to the treasurer or chair of the finance committee and or to the board chair and see whether or not they share your concerns. And then maybe even just talk to other board members and sort of say, you know, are other people seeing what I'm seeing, or am I misreading this? And so I think I would start it sort of one-on-one. And then if you don't feel like you're getting the response you want, then you might just have to bring it up to the full board and put it out in the open. And so I think that would be helpful from a board standpoint. If you're a staff member, sometimes a staff member needs to go to the board if they feel like, say, a CEO is performing financial malfeasance. And so typically I don't recommend, you know, staff members going around an executive director directly to the board, but this would be an instance where, yes, absolutely, a staff member should do that if they see a red flag and they feel that the executive director is the person responsible for it.
Great, thank you. All right, any final questions for David? With that, then I just want to have a thank you to David. Thank you so much for this presentation. I really appreciate the information. I think people were able to get a lot from it. And we will be following up with resources that were mentioned, such as the slides, the recording, and a couple of links to things that I heard throughout the session. But thank you all so much for being with us today. And with that, have a great afternoon.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And please do be in touch if I can be of any assistance.
Thank
Take
you.
care.